with the ghosts of a too recent past still wandering in the shadows, in a society devastated by the scars of the First World War. A man promised to restore to the German people a pride that had faded from their hearts. False promises, hopes infected with demagogy, and empty words for those desperately seeking quick and radical solutions to their country's problems were enough for that man, who would shake the pillars of the world to attain the power he had always dreamed of through democracy. Thus, in the instant that would decide the fate of humanity, on January 30th, 1933, after an agreement with conservative and nationalist leaders, Adolf Hitler was appointed Imperial Chancellor of Germany. The Nazi Party had the authority to transform the nation, to lay the foundations of the totalitarian regime that would follow that appointment. Pillars that rested on the notion that Germans were a superior race, human beings of the purest nature with the right to dominate the world. Hitler needed to justify the military expansion and the genocide that would come, and for that, everything revolved around proving the existence and the past of the Aryan race. Thus, Heinrich Himmler, leader of the SS and one of the main leaders of the Nazi Party, founded the Ahnenerbe or Ancestral Heritage, an association that would finance and support research activities to prove that the Germanic people constituted a superior type of humanity. With exaggerated and distorted results, supported by pseudoscientific statements, Himmler wanted to rewrite history and give the Führer ancient relics that would become symbols of greatness and above all a source of power for the Third Reich. Obsessed with occultism and mysticism, he was convinced of the existence of ancestral treasures lost in space and time that in his hands would grant them the powers to dominate the world. And among all the relics he longed to possess, one stood out above all. A symbol of divine presence that ensured victory over the enemy, the most elusive treasure in all of history, lost for 2,000 years. The chalice that, as legends told, granted eternal life. The same chalice that Christ drank from at the Last Supper, and which in his death contained the blood of the Son of God. Himmler was in search of the Holy Grail. The Nazi Party yearned to find the Holy Grail and turn it into the ultimate weapon of the Third Reich. And although everything seemed to come from ancient tales, that the Chalice of Christ was nothing more than a myth, as if it were a sign from destiny, a book came into their hands. A work recently published under the name Crusade Against the Grail. Its author, a German medievalist named Otto Rahn, was showing that the chalice was out there, lost, hidden somewhere. That there were clues that could lead to its whereabouts. They had in him the person they were looking for. Raised in a Jewish German family, Otto Rahn had been fascinated by tales of the Holy Grail from a very young age. A fascination that had led him to delve into medieval stories and ancestral myths to reconstruct the history of perhaps the most sought-after treasure of all time. A relic that, if it existed and were found, would make its discoverer an immortal name in history. And although his book did not have the success he had hoped for, it did reach the hands of one of the most important people in the rising regime. Thus, one morning in 1933, Rahn received a telegram from Himmler himself, requesting his presence to discuss his work and the Holy Grail. The Nazis were in search of sacred relics that could show the world as vestiges of the Germanic people. Powerful artifacts that would gift the Reich with unprecedented power. And they wanted him to guide them to the ultimate weapon. To hire him to search for the Holy Grail on behalf of the SS. Rahn knew that there was nothing magical about that hypothetical cup, that the only thing special about the so-called Chalice of Christ was its historical value, the religious implications of its discovery. He didn't even want to be part of a party so far from his ideals. But in the dark gaze of that man, he couldn't refuse. The Nazis had just begun the search for the Holy Grail. Tasked with doing what no one had achieved in 2 millennia, Ron knew that the path to the Grail, if it existed, began in the past. And although logic told us that history began with the Bible, that intuition failed. There is not a single mention in the canonical books of Christianity of something called the Holy Grail. The Bible speaks of Jesus using a cup during the Last Supper, but there is no indication that said chalice is special or possesses powers. Nor is there any mention that it was used to collect his blood during the crucifixion, or even that it was preserved. The idea of a chalice that grants eternal life may have its roots in the Celtic peoples who spread throughout Europe around the 8th century BCE. Their beliefs included sacred stones and legends about cauldrons that were sources of knowledge and inspiration. In the context of villages whose spiritual leaders believed in the immortality of the soul. However, centuries later, with the hegemony of a Christian religion that did not worship sacred stones or similar objects, all these legends became Christianized. The elements merged with Catholic writings until sometime later the idea of that relic that grants eternal life emerged again. The concept of the Grail emerged in the late 12th century when a French poet named Chrétien de Troyes published Perceval, the Story of the Grail. The poem tells the story of the young knight Perceval's visit to the castle of the Fisher King, where he witnesses a strange procession whose central element is a grail that, it is said, could heal the wounded king, who was bedridden. The poet died before he could finish his work, but the idea of that healing chalice had been established in literature, influencing the second major appearance of the treasure, this time at the hands of a German knight and poet. Between 1205 and 1215, Wolfram von Eschenbach wrote his poem Parzival, a reimagining of Chrétien's tale where the Grail takes the form of a magical stone, a gem that belonged to Lucifer when he was still an angel, guarded in the castle of Montsalvat, in the hands of the first king of the Grail. Belonging to the Templar order, Eschenbach was the first to assert that the Templars protected this sacred object, which he refers to as the lapsit exilis. The Grail granted them eternal life and knowledge that allowed them to become the most powerful militia the Church has ever had. The relationship between the relic and Christianity was emerging, to be consolidated shortly thereafter. In that same 13th century, the French poet Robert de Boron took up the torch from Chrétien and Eschenbach to write Joseph of Arimathea and the Story of the Holy Grail, a poem in 3 parts in which finally the concept is born. In Boron's version, influenced by the apocryphal text, not considered canonical by Christian denominations, of the Gospel of Nicodemus, a disciple of Christ briefly mentioned in the Bible becomes a key character in the story. Boron recounts that Joseph of Arimathea took the cup used by Jesus at the Last Supper, and carried it with him until the crucifixion. When a soldier pierced his body with a lance, he used the chalice to collect his blood, the blood of the Son of God deposited in what had just become the Holy Grail. The legend had been Christianized, and with it, a fever for the Chalice of Christ broke out, greatly influencing medieval literature. The stories of King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table emerge with a narrative focus on the search for the Holy Grail. Becoming a symbol of the search for truth, spiritual purity, and divine grace, Arthurian legends make it an entity that connects religious traditions with the search for the meaning of life. The line between fiction and reality blurs, and the Holy Grail settles as the most precious treasure in history. However, despite the hundreds of stories about its possible whereabouts and expeditions that promise to find it, the inability to find the sacred chalice gradually made hopes of finding that relic fade away. All roads led to dead ends. And so many centuries later, with no success, the legend of the Holy Grail seemed destined to remain just that, a mere legend, unless they were able to open a door that had always remained closed. Rahn believed that the Grail story and another of his great historical interests could converge towards the same destiny. In the 13th century in southern France, heretical communities emerged with beliefs opposed to those of the Catholic Church. Baptized as Cathars, they retained the knowledge of the Gnostic Gospels, prohibited and persecuted for not being part of the biblical canon. Gathered in caves they used as secret temples to profess their Christian faith, the Cathars defended thoughts threatening to the Church's hegemony. Therefore, Pope Innocent III declared Catharism a heresy and founded the Holy Inquisition, created to annihilate this small cult. The Cathars were gaining more and more followers. Entire villages began to assimilate what the Church considered an aberration. But the legend told that there was something more behind the order to massacre them. The stories spoke of the Cathars having in their possession the most sacred of relics, that they were the guardians of the Holy Grail. That was the reason why the Pope ordered the First Crusade in Europe, the first of Christians against Christians, a persecution to obtain the Chalice of Christ that lasted nearly 4 decades, until reaching the last chapter of the Cathar story. In 1244, with the cult practically extinguished, the last Cathars took refuge in the castle of Montsegur, a fortress atop a mountain to withstand the siege of the Inquisition. But after more than 9 months of resistance, on March 12th, the castle fell, and with the murder of the last 200 members, the Cathars were exterminated. However, legend has it that the night before the fall, 4 prefects managed to escape with the Cathar treasures, among them the Holy Grail, preventing it from falling into the hands of the Holy Inquisition. That was the last clue to its whereabouts. A legend from over 600 years ago. What had happened to it in that time was an absolute mystery. Rahn knew that everything they were doing was chasing shadows, searching for something they couldn't even be sure existed, and whose pillars were supported by medieval poems and popular legends. But with the pressure from the SS on him, he had to give something to Himmler, creating a story to fulfill the desires of the Nazi officer. Up until then, it had been considered that Montsegur, the castle where the Cathars settled before their extermination, had been the inspiration behind Montsalvat, the mountain described in Eschenbach's poem where the story told of the Grail being guarded by the supposed first king. But there was another possibility, one that explained why no trace of the Grail had been found in Montsegur and showed the final destination of the chalice after the Cathars saved it from the clutches of the Inquisition. It was possible that Eschenbach did not think of Montsegur for his Montsalvat, but rather another sanctuary south of the Pyrenees. A song from Catalan folklore spoke of a mystical fountain of life hidden in the Benedictine monastery of Montserrat, in the rocky massif near the city of Barcelona in Catalonia. Rahn had given him what he wanted to hear, a new resting place for the Holy Grail based again on nothing. Empty words that were enough to set out in search of it. In October 1940, with the Second World War having erupted, Himmler made a visit to Spain to discuss Hispano-German police cooperation and prepare for the anticipated meeting between Franco and Hitler, a diplomatic approach to the Francois regime with the expectation of Spain's entry into the conflict in support of the Axis powers. It was one of the very few trips the Nazi leader made to neutral countries, and there was a powerful motive behind it. After his stay in the capital, the German entourage flew to Barcelona, where they stayed for very few hours. Because that same afternoon, Himmler traveled to the monastery of Montserrat, 30 kilometers from the city. In his mind, he was going to have the Grail in his hands. However, upon reaching the monastery at the summit, the abbot refused to receive him. He did not want Nazis to set foot on sacred ground. Faced with the refusal, and as the only man in the abbey who spoke German, Himmler spoke with the young monk Andrew Ripoll, who assured him that there had never been anything like the Holy Grail at Montserrat. The Nazis found nothing on their visit to Catalan lands. Once again, the trail of the Holy Grail had led to a path of shadows. The one said to be destined to be the weapon of the Third Reich never came into their hands. But the final chapter of the search for the Chalice of Christ still had to be written. With spirituality, connection to the past, and the quest for meaning inspiring literature, art, and popular culture, the entrance into the 1960s was accompanied by a surge in interest in ancient relics. This situation revived the ambition to find the Holy Grail. The new technological advances achieved after the end of World War II made it feasible to analyze all those candidates that had been promising to be the true lost Chalice of Christ for centuries. And among all of them, one captured all the media attention. The Holy Chalice of Valencia, kept in the chapel of its cathedral, was the vessel that historically, the Aragonese and Valencian traditions had identified as the true Grail. Rumors that had started gaining traction in the 19th century, but until that moment, it was just one more of many candidates to be the lost relic of Christianity. Guarded in the cathedral of the Spanish city for over 500 years, the chalice consisted of two pieces. A cup carved from an agate stone and a foot adorned in gold with a base containing 28 small pearls, 2 rubies, and 2 emeralds. A treasure that could not belong to a poor carpenter from Jerusalem. This luxurious ornamentation had put a stop to all claims of the chalice's sacred origin. But in the year 1960, an investigation turned the story upside down. The archaeology professor at the University of Valencia, Antonio Beltran, conducted a study on the Holy Chalice. The results obtained from radiocarbon dating indicated that the two pieces that composed it had very different origins. The agate cup itself likely came from a Palestinian or Egyptian workshop and was carved sometime between 400 BC and 100 AD. Dates that fit within the time of Christ's Last Supper. But what truly set it apart was that the golden foot and the goldsmithing were created in the 11th century, with the aim of turning that cup into a treasure and being able to display it without touching its sacred part. Turning an ancient relic, a simple stone vessel, into something worthy of its nature. The nature of the Holy Grail. The Spanish archaeologists' investigation shook the foundations of the Christian community so strongly that in 1960, Pope John XXIII granted the Holy Chalice of Valencia the title of Vasculum Domini, or Chalice of the Lord, something that represented Christ's sacrifice for human redemption. The pontiff had given it a distinction that suggested special veneration, a recognition that made the cathedral's cup achieve worldwide fame. Thousands of believers trusted that finally, the enigma of the lost chalice had been solved. We had found the cup symbolizing the covenant of the Son of God with humanity. Obviously, the Spanish Episcopal Conference took advantage of that moment to officially declare that the Valencia chalice was the authentic Holy Grail. The attention of the archaeological community focused on the Spanish city, and the debate about its authenticity became tremendously popular. It was time to discover if what was hidden in the cathedral could be the chalice from the Last Supper. They had to reconstruct a hypothetical journey of the cup from Jerusalem to Valencia, a journey of nearly 2,000 years without even knowing if that was the true cup that the historical Jesus used in what the Bible described as the Last Supper. But after delving into endless historical documents, after months of work, they found that path. With the death of Jesus Christ, his apostles spread his teachings to other lands. Supposedly, around the year 62, His disciples Peter and Paul were preaching his word in Rome, and it made sense for them to have taken the Grail with them. Unlike the religion of the empire, all their faith was based on the figure of an individual. Everything rested on an already deceased Jesus. And the only way to convince people to join that new religion was by giving them evidence. Evidence in the form of relics. And the cup from which he drank what he said was his blood was the perfect candidate for this. A symbol of the covenant of the Messiah with humanity that could have helped Christianity grow in the heart of the Roman Empire. However, when the Great Fire of Rome broke out in the summer of the year 64 and much of the city was razed to ashes, Emperor Nero accused the Christians of causing the fire. Peter, considered the leader of that revolutionary and dangerous movement, died martyred, but not before safeguarding the most precious relic of his faith. Despite the initial persecution, the Christian religion grew in influence and power over the decades. This is where the main character of the story comes into play. Laurentius, who would later be known as Saint Lawrence, arrived in Rome in the 3rd century from his home in what is now Huesca, Spain. When in the year 257, Sixtus II was appointed pope, Lawrence was ordained a deacon and tasked with administering the assets and treasures of the church, among which possibly was the cup that had been guarded since the death of St. Peter. However, that same year, Emperor Valerian issued a persecution edict that banned Christian worship and ordered the execution of all bishops, priests, and deacons in the city of Rome. He was going to exterminate the prominent figures, banish the followers, and confiscate the church's treasures. With the martyrdom and death of Pope Sixtus II and aware of the fate that awaited him, Lawrence devoted his last moments of life to hiding the chalice. He took the Holy Grail out of Rome under the cover of darkness. Burned alive on a pyre in a cemetery and thus becoming a saint, St. Lawrence prevented the most important relic of Christianity from falling into the hands of the emperor. From the moment the Grail left Rome, its whereabouts became confusing. But everything seemed to indicate that St. Lawrence sent the Cup of Christ to Huesca, along with his family, where it would be hidden in monasteries in northern Spain for over 1,000 years, and receive the modifications that would turn it into a chalice worthy of a king. Since leaving Rome, the chalice is not mentioned again until a very specific date, December 14th, 1134. And it does so in the inventory of the most important monastery in Aragon in the High Middle Ages. Nestled in the mountainside, the monastery of San Juan de la Peña was home to a community of Benedictine monks who may have had the mission of guarding the chalice. Because in a document dated that December day, a monk named Don Carreras Ramirez had written a list of objects that included, as he wrote, the chalice that Christ our Lord had signed with his blood. The location of the monastery, near Lorenzo's hometown, was a strong indication that it could be that cup rescued 1,000 years before. The chalice is mentioned again in 1399, this time in connection with King Martin I of Aragon, who in historical records seem to have ordered the transfer of the chalice to his residence in Zaragoza, where it would remain under his rule and that of his successor Fernando I. After the death of the latter king in 1416, Alfonso V of Aragon ascended the throne and moved the court from Zaragoza to the royal palace of Valencia. They had reached the place they needed, and all intuitions materialized through a document in which the known as Alfonso the Magnanimous requested a loan from the Cathedral of Valencia to finance the military campaigns he was conducting in Italy. Because in that 1437 document, it was detailed that as a deposit the king had left in the cathedral, quoting verbatim, the chalice in which Christ consecrated his blood on Maundy Thursday. The loan was never repaid, or at least there were no records of it. Therefore, that chalice that Alfonso V had left 500 years later had to still be there. They had reconstructed the history of the Grail, and although they could not affirm that the Valencia chalice was the true relic, as the direct connection to biblical events could not be sufficiently described, it was enough to put the cathedral in the spotlight of Christianity. Such was the impact that years later, on November 8, 1982, Pope John Paul II visited Valencia to celebrate a Mass in the cathedral where he venerated the Chalice of the Last Supper. An event of enormous international repercussion that seemed to seal all the mysteries surrounding the sacred cup. The search for the Holy Grail seemed to have ended, but we had only opened the door to a new mystery. A mystery that threatened to collapse the pillars of the Catholic Church through the best-kept secret of all time. With the story of the Valencia chalice spreading worldwide and in the context of a renewed fever for the relic, the Holy Grail became once again a powerful source of inspiration for literature and cinema. Many authors took the legends of the cup as the central narrative of famous works of fiction, but amidst this fervor, one book captured all the attention. A work that did not present itself as fiction, but as an investigation that questioned nearly 2,000 years of Christian theology. Through a controversial hypothesis, it claimed to shake the foundations of the Catholic Church. In 1982, Michael Bagant, Richard Lai, and Henry Lincoln published the book The Holy Blood and the Holy Grail, a research work that aimed to be historical, in which they presented a highly controversial theory that shook the entire world. The British writers asserted that the Holy Grail was not the cup that Jesus used at the Last Supper. It was not the chalice in which his blood was collected during the crucifixion. It had never been an object. The Holy Grail was a baby. The daughter of Christ in the womb of Mary Magdalene, the secret wife of the venerated Son of God. The authors created a whole narrative supposedly supported by historical evidence, discussing the greatest cover-up in the history of religion. A secret that the Catholic Church had hidden since the construction of the pillars of Christianity to protect the divinity of Jesus. The Holy Grail was the blood of Christ, preserved through his descendants. A lineage that threatened the hegemony of a church that did everything possible to conceal that Christ's throne belonged to the children of Jesus and Mary Magdalene. The foundations of this theory were based on the medieval poems that created the legend around the Grail, including those of Chrétien de Troyes and Robert de Boron, which referred to the relic as Saint Graal, a concept where Saint came from sanctus or holy, and Graal from a Celtic word to refer to something similar to a vessel. But it was possible that we had translated them incorrectly, that those poets never spoke of an object, that the Sangreal was actually Sangreal, blood of royalty. The Holy Grail, what we had always been searching for, was the lost lineage of Christ. The authors suggested that the chalice, symbolized and represented as a V, was a sign of femininity that often also illustrated the shape of a woman's womb. The cup we believed to be the Holy Grail was a simple symbol, an allegory of Mary Magdalene's pregnancy. In the Gnostic Gospels, rejected in the biblical canon, the marital relationship between Mary Magdalene and Jesus was already hinted at, as he was a Jew in the Roman Empire. In a culture that valued family and marriage, it was normal for him to have been married, and she was the woman closest to him. Their narrative told that Mary was pregnant at the time of the crucifixion and worshipped alongside him as the chosen one by God. Therefore, after her husband's death, she had to flee Jerusalem to protect not only herself, but also the baby she carried within her with Christ's blood. Mary then sought refuge in the city of Alexandria, where she gave birth to a daughter named Sarah, which in Hebrew means princess. When the little girl grew up, they both traveled to southern France, where Sarah married into the Merovingian kings, a dynasty of medieval monarchs. Through them, Christ's lineage remained protected through generations, and the story of Mary Magdalene and Jesus' descendants became a cult that would soon be persecuted. In the year 325, Emperor Constantine I the Great convened the First Council of Christian Bishops in order to establish a unified and coherent form of Christianity. At the Council of Nicaea, the early church wanted above all to eliminate any connection between the New Testament and pagan cults. And that story of the marriage between Jesus Christ and Mary Magdalene was too similar to the Egyptian myth of Osiris and Isis, which appealed to pagan beliefs celebrating the sexual union between deities. Therefore, the archbishops decided to bury the memory of Mary, and the Gnostic writings considered heresy were persecuted. In secret, the Merovingians continued Christ's lineage, bearing what we understood as the Holy Grail in their veins. However, around the year 750, their power had diminished so much, relegated to a purely ceremonial role, that something had to be done to protect that line of descendants. And it was at that moment that the authors spoke of something called the Priory of Sion, a cult allegedly formed in 1099 solely and exclusively to preserve Christ's lineage. A secret organization responsible for conceiving the Order of the Knights Templar. The Priory of Sion wanted to find lost scrolls, a genealogy of Christ's descendants, which they baptized as the documents of royal blood. And through the Templars they found them. The ultimate weapon to use against the powerful Catholic Church. The wealth of the Templars came precisely from blackmailing it, as the documents could expose their lie. Safeguarding that secret, the Templars enjoyed unprecedented power. Until October 13th, 1307, when King Philip IV of France, along with Pope Clement V, ordered the extinction of the order. The Knights Templar were exterminated, but protected by the Priory of Sion, they couldn't find the documents. That desperation to destroy the lineage secret was precisely what they masked as the search for the Holy Grail. They were never seeking Christ's chalice. All they wanted was that genealogy. A genealogy that came into the hands of the Cathars, the heretical communities that Otto Rahn had linked with the Grail in his work. The crusade against them, the foundation of the Holy Inquisition, the siege of Montsegur Castle, everything converged in the same place. The Church wanted to seize the most important documents in the history of civilization. Legends told of a few Cathars who managed to escape with their treasures, and there was no treasure more precious than that genealogy. Christ's lineage survived the persecution, and definitively guarded by the Priory of Sion, it passed from one master to another. The documents and the lineage have survived through the centuries. The Holy Grail remains alive somewhere. The impact of Bajent Lincoln and Lee's book was immediate. The work became a bestseller, made headlines, and sparked intense debate about the possibility of their theory being true. They claim to have spent 6 years researching, visiting private collections and various libraries in England and France. However, from the outset, it was clear that the sources were dubious. And above all, there was a feeling that they had constructed the narrative trying to justify their premise, their controversial theory. As historians, they needed to undo that path and find the truth lost amidst fiction. The cornerstone of the story was the marriage between Mary Magdalene and Jesus, and they hadn't provided any evidence, not a single historical document indicating that bond. It was common for Jews to marry young, but the lack of mentions in the Bible does not prove they were husband and wife. Even Christ's celibacy was not important for the Church. What mattered to Christianity was his message. In certain Gnostic writings, it could be inferred that Mary was special to him, but none mention anything beyond a relationship of respect. However, the big revelation of the book What had turned it into a global phenomenon, and what seemed to justify the existence of a lost lineage, was that secret cult referred to as the Priory of Sion. The authors vowed to find some documents in the National Library of France in Paris that connected this organization to Jesus' descendants. In those historical archives, which had gone unnoticed until then, it spoke of the foundation of the Priory of Sion in 1099 as protectors of the Holy Grail. But with strong suspicions, analyzing the documents, it was determined that they were forgeries. The papyrus was not from the 11th century. The dating placed its creation in the year 1956. They were no more than 30 years old. The investigation pointed to a man as responsible for the scam, a French artist named Pierre Plantard. The artist claimed to be a descendant of a line of Merovingian kings, and to prove the truth of his words, he created what they now knew was one of the great deceptions in French literature. Plantard invented the story of the Priory of Sion, and created some scrolls emulating ancient writing where he placed himself as part of that lineage, declaring himself a descendant of the protectors of the Holy Grail. That document, which Plantard had strategically hidden in the National Library for someone to find, was the basis of the Holy Blood and the Holy Grail. Everything rested on a lie. There was no priory, no secret organization guarding what they said was the great secret of Christianity. It all stemmed from the deceit of a French artist and his desire to become famous and rich. With the evidence of the forgery presented, Plantard was arrested and admitted under oath that the entire story was a hoax. The Priory of Sion was a sham, and with that, the pillars of the book that sought to revolutionize the Church's faith collapsed under its own weight. The tale of Christ's lost lineage lost strength until it practically faded away. However, when in 2003, American writer Dan Brown published The Da Vinci Code, a novel that took the 1980s theory about Jesus' descendants, the Priory of Sion, and the Church's struggle to silence the secret of the Holy Grail, everything exploded again. The novel became a worldwide bestseller, with over 79 million copies sold, and theories about the true nature of the Grail spread like wildfire through the media. An interest that persists to this day. 2,000 years after it all began, we are still talking about it. We don't know if we have found it, we don't even know its nature or if it has survived the passage of time. But maybe it doesn't matter. Because we are not just looking for an object. We are looking for something in which many people place their hopes. And it is in that search that many have found their destiny.